Upgrades. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another JVS movie review brought to you from the Toronto Film Festival. This film here is called The Return, and here's a quick synopsis. When Odysseus washes up on the shores of his home of Ithaca after 20 years fighting in and returning from the Trojan War, scarred by his experiences, he is unrecognizable from his mighty warrior king that left 20 years before. His wife Penelope is now a prisoner in her own home, hounded by many suitors to choose a new husband that will take the throne. And this is directed by Uberto Pasolini. It stars Ralph Fiennes, Juliette Binoche, and Charlie Plummer. Now, here's the thing. Homer's Odyssey as a story has been told a multitude of times in multiple different ways. Immediately what jumped for me with The Return was the point that they decided to show this story from a perspective of a man who has been broken by war, who almost is suffering from PTSD from everything that he's experienced. So when Odysseus washes up on the shores, we don't necessarily know exactly what's going on with him. All we understand is that he's very reluctant to return back home to the world he left to be king, partially because he is terrified of what people would think of him. The other aspect of it is that he led so many men to their deaths, and he just doesn't want to deal with those consequences. On the flip side of it, we have his wife Penelope, who is being hounded by everyone humanly possible when you see her at the beginning of this film. And we just see her toiling away in her home, making this quote scarf type of garment and telling everybody once this is done, then she'll look up for her husband, but looking for a new husband while she's still pining for her husband who left her when everyone's telling her he's not returning. Like this is such a departure from the traditional way to tell Homer's Odyssey, which most people, when they do tell this story, they go for the fantastic elements of it, the elements of it, the monsters, the sea creatures, things of this nature. Like that tends to be the way to go. Or you do focus on the Trojan War and you go that route. But here, Uberto, who decided that he just wanted to show this from a different perspective of what it would be like once that man got home. And Ralph Fiennes, who is having a phenomenal year this year, puts together this performance, and he's just so broken in this film. And we see his reluctancy to allow people to understand who he is, because he just doesn't want to be known as a king anymore. And everything that encompasses, down to leaving his wife, down to leaving his son. And those elements are what make The Return special. Because again, once you go and touch a story that everyone knows, you have to find an original way to do so. And here, it's definitely an original way explored on exactly what everything Odysseus went through in that war and how that would literally have to have it had affected him. As we see the rest of the kingdom is just falling apart here. As Penelope refuses to pick a husband and all her suitors have decided to take over her palace and hold her prisoner up until she decides who she wants to marry. Like, when you get those elements, you also get an element of just new villains to look out for. Unfortunately for The Return, a lot of them just feel bargain basement. It's nothing that overly sticks out about them. Again, the key element of this film is really how it is to return from war and what mental anguish someone would have if they led men to war and came back with none of them. And how would their people look upon them? Like, it's so many different elements of exactly what PTSD can be in this film. It just makes it all amazing, because it's not just the PTSD of him going to war. It's Penelope and her knowing she should move on, wanting to pine for her husband, and yet and still understanding, like, this is not an ideal situation to ever be in. It's just so many different elements of the exact same story. And that's why it's hard to harp on this story, because you know it already. You know the story of Homer's Odyssey. Everyone knows that story. So just to take that element and say, I want to focus on the element that no one really focuses on when they tell this story, that's what makes this film original. And it is shot masterfully well. Like, this film is beautiful on so many different levels, not just because of the landscape. It's beautiful in its tragic depiction of a kingdom falling apart because the king left it and has not returned. Like, all of those shots are what makes this movie great. Like, it gives you visually a setup to understand the despair that everyone is in as they're awaiting the return of this king, but how they don't believe that's ever going to happen, and then his wife have to deal with the ramifications of that. Like, those are elements of just what makes The Return so special, along with Juliette Binoche and Ralph Fiennes putting on two great performances here. And I mean, absolutely great. By the time we get to the third act, which you automatically understand will be the most explosive element of it, any action depicted in that act doesn't feel like a cheap thrill. And that's what you worry about with these type of films, is that when you ramp up the action, it just feels like you're just throwing action just to throw action in the film. But here, all of it is purposefully done and brilliantly shot in close quarters and everything. Like, this is, again, one of the best looking films of the year with two great performances. But The Return, brought to you from the Toronto Film Festival. Out of a possible 10, I am going to give The Return an 8 out of 10. This is a really good film and takes a very different depiction on Homer's Odyssey and what that looks like to have to return from that type of war. Like, again, it's an element you don't think about when you think about that story. Again, you just think about the fantastical creatures and things of this nature that he goes through, but you don't really think about, once he gets home, how is that going to weigh on him? And this film does a great job of showing you that. And at times it can drag you down a bit, but by the time you get to the third act, you're rewarded for your patience with this film. And that's something that you should thoroughly enjoy as a movie theater, because I thoroughly enjoyed it while I was watching it. But check it out. When it drops, let us know what you think. This has been another JVS movie review brought to you from the Toronto Film Festival. Peace, people.